Welcome to the Think Christian podcast and our Best of 2020 mega show. I'm Josh Larson, excited to have the whole podcast team joining me for this one. Our favorite pop culture of last year, those movies, TV shows, and albums that reminded us there's no such thing as secular. It was a year, and as much as we'd like to forget 2020 ever happened, we also wanted to take some time to celebrate the pop culture highlights of the last 12 months. You know, pop culture provided me some solace, some distraction, and also delivered prophetic wake-up calls during a year that was defined both by disease and also stark racial inequality. We're going to cover offerings of all those types on this show. As I said, we're mostly going to discuss picks from the entire podcast team, but we wanted to sprinkle in choices from you, the Think Christian community, as well. Via social media, emails, and the like, we heard from many of you about your favorite TV shows, movies, and music of last year. So before we get to our picks, and spoiler, those include the likes of Ted Lasso, Phoebe Bridgers, Punisher, and Pixar's Soul, let's start with a couple of listener recommendations. Mitch Wiley's going to kick things off with this email about the concert film David Byrne's American Utopia, which just barely missed my personal top 10 films of the year list. Here's Mitch. My favorite movie from the difficult year of 2020 was the concert film American Utopia. Two of the foremost American artists, David Byrne and Spike Lee, team up in a film that is at once life-affirming and also brutally honest about the struggles to find human connection. Humans are wondrously made in God's image and therefore are beautiful to behold in all of our odd ways. Byrne himself is an eccentric wonder on stage, dancing, singing, and shouting nonsense. He's joined by his troupe of musicians, all of whom move freely and effortlessly around the stage in a joyous manner, reminding me of the freedom of God's people in the already kingdom of God. In the midst of this human freedom is the sad reality of a utopia or a kingdom of God that is not yet. Capturing the zeitgeist of the protests and activism in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others, Byrne and Lee used their platform to advocate for political, social, and cultural progress towards something more reminiscent of the freedom, connection, and joy of God's kingdom. Thank you for that, Mitch. Yeah, I do remember wondering how Spike Lee, who's the director here, was going to match with David Byrne, the musical mastermind. But wow, did they work together well. Turned out to be an invigorating partnership for them both and for us as viewers. One more email here from listener and occasional TC contributor Jonathan Cana. One of the most evocative movies I saw is Amy Seimetz's experimental thriller, She Dies Tomorrow. It revolves around a high-concept story involving a woman's inexplicably certain premonition that she's going to die the next day, spreading like a viral contagion throughout her circle of influence and into the community at large. The characters in this story seem to realize how their quest for more and better in life had distracted them from savoring what they already have, which for me immediately conjured Jesus' parable in Luke 12, about a wealthy man who builds a palatial estate so that he can sit back and enjoy his wealth, only to learn that this very night your life will be demanded from you. In its own way, She Dies Tomorrow offers a similar parable, warning viewers that tomorrow isn't promised to any of us. So what are we going to do today that will have eternal significance? Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Mitch. That was just some of the great feedback that we received. Do keep those picks coming in, especially if we haven't mentioned by the end of the show one of your favorites from 2020. We're going to compile a massive recommendations list for the show notes to this episode, and we can always add your picks to that. So to send those in, email us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. That's tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. Okay, Jonathan and Mitch got us off to a good start, so let's dig in with a survey of the best television of 2020. So this is going to be fun. I've got three guests joining me for our Best of TV segment: Claude Atcho, J.R. Forasteros, and Michelle Reyes. I'm guessing that each of you, probably like me, ended up watching more TV than ever this year, staying at home, quarantining. Was that the case for each of you? Or I'm curious if your TV viewing habits changed at all in this very strange 2020. Maybe, JR, I'll start with you. What did that look like for you this year?
I came close to exhausting Netflix, which I wouldn't have thought possible. And fortunately, it's sort of the bittersweet of this golden age of streaming, right? We're getting close to having a combined streaming cost that is comparable to cable back before we all cut our cords. But it also means there's at least a lot of new content coming our way. So I always managed to find something I hadn't seen yet that someone had recommended to be good. So watch so much more TV this year.
Yeah, I've started to realize that too. Those, $7.99 a month deals are starting to pile up. How about you, Michelle? What was TV watching like for you in 2020?
Yeah, I actually had the opposite experience. I think it just comes with the territory of being a mom with young kids. And with COVID, my son was supposed to be in kindergarten and ended up staying home, and we're now doing homeschooling. But then I also have like 3 jobs. So I'm one of those people that the New York Times described as like working on the 3rd shift, right? Like my job starts at 5 a.m. and, I'm working into the late hours of the night. And so I found that last year, beginning in March, I almost like stopped watching TV completely, but I can tell you almost every Disney film that's on Disney Plus. And I'm completely up to date with Blippi and Cocomelon, so if anyone wants to talk about that, I'm
assuming
all
those
over
are
that.
TV shows, so maybe that could make your best of list, Michelle.
Yeah,
I was going to say, when are we doing like TC Kids?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Hey,
I'm
I
here for
can
that.
Sympathize with the 3 jobs. I'm just fortunate most of those involve watching movies and TV, so
Nice.
I kind of pulled that trick. Claude,
Nice.
how about you watching TV this year? What was it like?
Man, actually I watch a little bit more, but I don't watch a lot of TV. We kind of just do the movie thing. We even at a recent point had Netflix buy DVDs because I was tired of picking, what they had. So this year, me watching a couple TV shows was an uptick from basically watching none.
All right. Well, let's start with you, Claude, because you do have a pick for Best of TV this year. It's something that came out earlier in the year, and it is ESPN's Michael Jordan documentary series, The Last Dance. We'll get to JR, your pick, and Michelle, your pick. Those are Ted Lasso and The Queen's Gambit, just so people know what's coming ahead. But right now, let's talk a little bit about The Last Dance. It arrived in April, and it sort of filled the void of all sports being canceled at that point, is where we were with the pandemic. What made it special for you kind of beyond that timing, though, Claude? I remember feeling, this is exactly, as an NBA nerd, what I needed at that time. But now that we're at the end of the year, sports has come back. What stands out to you that does make The Last Dance one of the best things you saw on TV in 2020?
Yeah, I think you hit on it a little bit. It kind of gives us multiple things. It kind of fulfills multiple needs. So early in the pandemic, The Last Dance was something for everyone to talk about, especially sports fans, right? It allowed us to bond and converse around the stuff that we love to converse around, Jordan versus LeBron, hoops. But at the same time, it was really meaningful during the pandemic as kind of nostalgic, comfort food. Like it was just a return to a simpler time. It brought me back to just loving basketball, having Jordan posters on my wall and just kind of relived some major moments of my childhood. It was a healthy kind of escape. But I think in terms of as a TV show, as art in and of itself, it gave some good food for thought too. I think just getting the angle of Jordan, the man, talking about Jordan, the man and the myth, having him really commentate and reflect on his career. And obviously it's skewed, it's really from his perspective, but there's other voices too. It's just really interesting to see sort of his psyche and sort of him as a human and him as somebody not out of the limelight of fame, but at a different point in his life, looking back and reflecting. And it prompted, I think, a lot of really interesting conversations that I had with friends and just reflection I had within, my own thinking about like leadership and greatness and glory and like what it means to achieve. And can you achieve without being a leader who crushes other people? The way we kind of hear how Jordan crushed people and how much we sort of can give a pass to greatness just because somebody's great and we don't deal with some of the uglier sides that come with that. So I think, on a lot of levels, the show was just really meaningful, a chance to bond, some comfort food, and some really deep things to think about.
Yeah, we did touch on some of those when we talked about the show on an earlier episode. Catherine Freeman and I think it was episode 31. And the theme of that show was humility, which seems like an odd theme for a show about Jordan because certainly in the documentary, he didn't show a lot of that. But at the same time, I feel like he revealed things about himself that maybe he didn't intend to and were food for thought in terms of leadership, as you said, Claude. And we could apply those to questions of Christian leadership. Where does humility fit in if you are in a position to lead. And if you do want to pursue excellence, which I think is a Christian call, how can you do that maybe with humility? We also wrote about The Last Dance on the TC website. Joshua Coldigelli had a good piece. He called it The Bulls in the Body and referenced 1 Corinthians 12 and just kind of this idea of the vision of the church needing many people to be doing many things. And it isn't really just this one godlike figure who's going to lead the church. So there's a lot of good stuff there in The Last Dance. It's lasted for me, lingered for me too, throughout the whole of 2020. There's a lot of sports balling talk. I think JR probably not up your alley. Michelle, I believe you said you watched a little bit of The Last Dance, though?
Yeah, my husband and I, we binge watched it.
Whole thing, okay.
It was amazing. We're both athletes and big fans of basketball. And, definitely that nostalgia, as Claude mentioned, about just growing up in the Michael Jordan era. One thing that just stuck out to me was most of us, we're generally talented in something, right? We're pretty good at something. But watching that show, it made me wonder, what is it like to be the best at something? What was it like to be the great? There's no one like Michael Jordan. You know what I mean? And so kind of pulling back the curtains and getting this perspective of his life. And certainly all these things about he was a bully and he pushed people. But then there was also people who were interviewed who were in tears by how much he inspired them, right? But then also he didn't have a normal life and just, swarmed by fans and news reporters all the time. It just, I don't know. I watched it and actually felt he became a more sympathetic figure for me of just I have no idea what it's like to live that kind of life and to be the best at something and just feel like a complete exception to the norm. But it certainly doesn't excuse being a bully, but it just made me see him and his life from a very different perspective.
Yeah, I think it helped me understand why he was the way he was. And I don't know if you need to feel empathy for someone that famous and successful, but you do understand what it might be like to sit in their shoes and be thought of that way and have those expectations put on yourself by others and also hold them for yourself. It can't be a pretty head to be in, a pretty place to be in. And so there was an element of empathy and sympathy to The Last Dance, even for Jordan. I felt that too. Let's stick with you, Michelle, and move on to The Queen's Gambit. This is a Netflix limited series. It stars Anya Taylor-Joy as Beth Harmon, a chess prodigy in the late 1950s, early 1960s. It takes place. Now, on the TC website, Deb Coster wrote about The Queen's Gambit, and she focused on Beth's search as an orphan, her search for place. She's got to make her way on her own, mostly through the man's world of chess, really. Deb wrote that the friendships in the series show a generous compassion, one that speaks the truth in love and abounds in grace. So that's something Deb appreciated about The Queen's Gambit. Does that resonate, Michelle, for you with your experience of the show? What made this one of the best shows of 2020 for you?
Definitely. I was actually going to talk about that because I know a lot of folks will want to categorize The Queen's Gambit as just another feminist show about a woman rising to beat the odds. And I don't think that's the point of this series. I don't think we're supposed to reach the ending where she beats the Russian chess player and think, wow, she beat all the odds. Look, a woman can do anything. Because we know from the beginning she's this brilliant brainchild and we know she's going to break all the barriers and win all the awards from the very beginning. But what stood out to me was Beth's journey of self-discovery and the importance that friendships, mentorship, and family play along the way, because she's a woman who's suffered from numerous traumas, including a very aversive childhood, parental mental illness, the death of a parent, growing up in an orphanage. And then, of course, certainly she's navigating a male-dominated chess scene in the 50s and 60s. But for me, the most interesting part of the show was how she had to contend with these inner demons, her insecurity, her self-loathing, a lacking sense of self. And as a girl in the orphanage, she develops her coping mechanism is an addiction to this fictionalized sedative called Zanzolam, which is very similar to the popular Librium in the 60s, which was prescribed very liberally as a cure for anxiety and insomnia and withdrawal symptoms, and also liberally prescribed for women during that time. But what's interesting is that at first, the drugs seemingly help her. They help clear her head, allow her to map out entire games. But it's also these same drugs, along with her addiction to alcohol, that heighten her insecurity and self-loathing and ultimately lead to self-destructive behaviors. But throughout the highs and lows of the show, while her resilience is commendable, it's those who's invested in her life and that create this family that I think play such a big role. And I think that's where we see an important lesson and truth for Christians watching this show is that it doesn't matter how smart or successful you are, you can't do it alone. We need to live life with our church family, with the body of Christ. It says in Ecclesiastes 4:10, if either person falls down, one can help the other up, but pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. And so I think that's why the scene at the end was so touching when Beth is about to finish her match with Vasily Borgov. She's still struggling with whether or not to take drugs and alcohol, but in that moment, her friends from New York, including Benny Watts and Harry Beltic, call her and they walk her through all these possible chess plays. And it's exactly this kind of encouragement and love and warmth that she needs to release from her dependence on substances and perform well. And spoiler alert, she goes on to win the final match. But I think the power of relationships and even mentorship through Mr. Scheibel plays an important role in her life. It's the only thing that keeps her grounded and stable. And her friends even pursue her when she pushes them away, which I think is exactly what the biblical model of friendship is, right? That we need to embrace each other, especially our brothers and sisters in Christ, pursue them at all costs, no matter how much they're struggling or they try to push us away. Because like it also says in Proverbs 17:17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. So the role of friendship and family really stuck out to me.
As you're describing the last episode, Michelle, it strikes me this was kind of a sports series too, in a way.
It was.
And here we've got Ted Lasso as well, so I don't know how that happened. But maybe it didn't strike me initially as that because you're right, the focus does shift away from the competitions themselves, and it is something of a foregone conclusion because we do know her talent. Man, we know the trajectory of these sort of narratives, but the focus really does shift to what is going to move Beth in a different place psychologically. Now, JR, I'm curious, there was a Twitter thread where we mentioned that this was going to come up on the podcast, and I couldn't tell. Twitter is not a great place for communication, but it seemed like you maybe had a little skepticism about the Queen's Gambit, or did I read that wrong?
You read it right. I thought it was fine. I am like one of 3 people I found that was whelmed by this show. Not underwhelmed. I mean, it had great production value. I thought they recreated the era really well. I went looking, I think when I was in episode 3 or 4 to find like, oh, it has the feel of based on a true story, So I was like, oh, I want to read the real. And as soon as she starts appearing on all these magazine covers and stuff, I was like, oh gosh, like I just want to go real quick and, find all those articles that are inevitable. That's like, how true was it or the blah, blah, blah. And like the instant that I found out that this was an entirely fabricated story, I was like, okay, I couldn't care less about what happens in the story because okay, so this is just me, and it will probably inform why I picked Ted Lasso. Like, I couldn't care less about stories about beautiful, brilliant, wealthy people who have problems. I'm like, oh, tell me again how hard it is. And that's not to diminish anything Michelle said. I think everything she said is totally true about how this story works. But like, I mean, I just, as a nerd who loves nerdy things, like one of their nerdy tropes is like the single nerd girl walks into a comic store and all of the fat, weird guys in the comic store are like, and that's how this show felt to me. It's like, oh yeah, here's this beautiful, like perfect, brilliant girl who walks into chess tournaments and all the guys are like, just drooling over her and, I don't know. Like Michelle, I was so glad to hear you say that you didn't think it had much to say about like feminism, because it really, like, it was almost completely uninterested in that, even though it set it up so hard in the first couple of episodes. So I thought it was a great show. I thought Anna Taylor-Joy did a great job. The whole cast did a great job. And again, I think all the things Michelle said are true, but like I got to the end of it and I was like, okay, sure. Like that wasn't bad. I didn't hate it. But like all these people kept raving about it.
Yeah, I think it was one of those where the raving does alter your expectations. I came to it a little later too. Even after my daughter was actually watching it first and other people online were going crazy for it. So I think that probably altered my expectations a little bit. I can see somewhat of what you're saying, JR. One of the other qualities they give to Beth is that she becomes this fashionista. She's really interested in the styles of the time. And I felt like that was kind of like they came up with that idea and that's all they did with it, was like find another great dress for her to wear. And, costume design is one of the things I'm really interested in movies and TV. And I just wish there was more. It was kind of for those moments you're talking about, JR, like when she was going to wow the men, they put her in a really fashionable 60s outfit. And it didn't really go any deeper than that for me. The only other hiccup I had, which I'm curious, Michelle, what you thought about this, you talked about the drugs that she was given as a kid in the orphanage, and she becomes addicted to that. Alcohol becomes involved as well. And I think you're right. The overall trajectory was how this was not healthy for her in the end. And it certainly, takes a turn to recognize that in the last episode. But really, almost up until that, it was this really dicey line for me of, is this how Beth is winning? Because she would take these pills, have these visions of chess on the ceiling, and it really equated in a lot of scenes for me is like, this is where her powers come from. And I know the overall narrative tries to prove that wrong, but man, they take a long time to get there. Did you get a sense of that at all, Michelle?
Yeah, it is one of the more curious and confusing elements of the show, for sure. I think what helps temper it is I think in particular, the figures of both her biological mother and her adopted mother, because they are two women who also turn to substances, these sedatives as well as alcohol. And both of those women do not find that same sort of stability in their lives. And I think Beth Harmon's trajectory is that unless some sort of friendship or family can step in. And so I think they do certainly explore in the show the experience of young women and housewives who are physically healthy yet dissatisfied with their positions in the mid-20th century America. And instead of being able to cope mentally and be able to achieve, say, financial independence, like her adopted mom, or pursuing more high-status careers outside of the home, these substances, hinder their trajectories in life. And so I think those two women taper that commentary. I'll say on the side note, I agreed with you about the costumes. To me, that was one of the elements in the show that I felt fell flat. Being an academic myself, I have math friends. Like if you are that smart and you see she is lacking certain social cues, certain social dynamics, like there are parts of her personality that are missing or underdeveloped, a woman like that would not have that sort of sense of fashion. So to me, that was one element that I thought, that's not believable.
Okay. I'm so glad you brought up her adoptive mother, played by Mariel Heller, filmmaker herself, actually directed the Mr. Rogers film, Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Mariel Heller gives a great performance, and I think that is a notable distinction when it comes to the addiction element, Michelle. I'm really glad you brought that up because her trajectory definitely is a different experience than what Beth has, and I think that's important to note. All right, so that is the Queen's Gambit, addiction, abuse, some heavy things going on there. Let's move to something lighter. Let's move to Ted Lasso. This was your pick, JR, and maybe even more than the Queen's Gambit. This is a show I had people recommending to me very loudly, very enthusiastically. I did want to mention a comment we got on Facebook from Think Christian follower Jason Vandenbrink. He named it as well as one of his favorite shows of 2020. And Jason wrote, Ted Lasso presents a better vision for how to live our lives. We need this at any time, but at this time, it feels especially poignant. So, JR, do you think that the timing did sort of help the reception of Ted Lasso here? Getting a positive show like this at the end of a dumpster fire of a year, that kind of boost its chances? Or do you think it would have? Yeah, go ahead.
Like you, I had so many people not grab me by the shoulder because social distancing, but virtually grab me by the shoulder and shake me, and say, you must see this. The sort of phrasing that they kept using was, it's like, it's warm, it's feel good. It honestly, one of the reasons it took me so long to get to it was because it sounded like it was going to be saccharine and superficial. And I wasn't really in a place where I wanted saccharine and superficial. I wanted something that had some meat, that actually had some hope to it, not just numbing, but actually providing some hope. And I think that is exactly what Ted Lasso gives us and why it has resonated so strongly, particularly in the pandemic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you wrote, we should note too, about Ted Lasso on the TC website a little while back. I think for me, I was a little skeptical too. And even at the beginning, the first couple episodes, it takes a while to realize, like, is there going to be genuine warmth, or is this guy just kind of hokey and corny? And I think it does get to that point where he's not just bringing positivity, but he's bringing relationship as this coach in a situation where he doesn't know at all what he's doing. And that's an important distinction, I think, for why there's a little bit more going on in this show. I think a lot of it is encapsulated really in the opening credits. I'm kind of a fan of, series episodes that have great opening credits that kind of capture everything going on in the show. And here you have Ted Lasso going into this football stadium, soccer stadium, sitting on a seat all by himself, capturing the idea of he's an out-of-place guy here in England as an American football coach. And then as soon as he sits in these blue seats, like the one he sits on, I think it turns red, right? They kind of spread out around him. They get painted over just magically. And if you'll notice, some of the blue seats have graffiti on them, and the red just kind of covers that up too. And it's just such a great image for, the goodwill that Ted Lasso kind of brings whenever he goes into the locker room or even goes into his boss's office. And I think that the show for me has spread out similarly as the episodes have gone on. Now, Claude, you've watched a couple episodes of Ted Lasso. What's your experience been with it?
I was attracted to it just because I love soccer. And so that was a hook for me. But, one of the things you just said, Josh, about, he's driven by relationship and he brings, no knowledge of the game to this new coaching position. And I think it's really the inverse of a lot of what we do, out of, the worst of our broken nature is that we do bring skills, but because we can hide behind skills, we're not so concerned with relationship. And I think what's really interesting with Ted Lasso as a character is just really earnest, and I think that gets developed, it sounds like, more fully, as the show goes on. But even from the jump, he's just an earnest character. He wants to know and be known, which obviously biblically we know that's what we're made for, to know and to be known. And so he embodies that in a way that I think is just it's just refreshing to see that captured in a character. And, there's some hokiness to it, but, as you see, what he does with the biscuits and all these sort of things and how he treats his supervisor, the owner of the team, even as she is, just horrible and trying to, she has her own plans, mischievous plans. He remains, earnest and gentle and relational and forgiving and loving and all of these sorts of things. And it's just refreshing to see that. That is the sort of vision that I think we need and obviously resonates deeply with the hope we have in the scriptures.
Yeah, those biscuits are so key, these cookies that he brings to her, the owner, every day, because it's an example of how he is annoying and he could be thoroughly annoying, but he also kind of recognizes, he knows like she does appreciate these cookies. And so it's to your point of known and being known, is he's not just barging into the office for his own needs, but he's bringing something to her as well. So I like that little
morning
motif.
mercy.
There you go.
I think in fiction, one of the hardest things to create is a truly wholesome character who is not naive. Wholesomeness and kindness and gentleness so often read as naivety. And as a comics fan, I would point to someone like Superman, right? Like, it's hard to even imagine Superman, muttering a curse under his breath if someone cut him off in traffic. Not just because he flies most of the time, but just in general, right? Like, it's hard to even imagine him doing that because he's so wholesome. On the Marvel side, it's someone like Iron Fist, and I think that, not to get way off topic, but that's where the show Iron Fist fell down, because the Netflix show, like, he was just naive. He was just stupid. Like, he just didn't understand how people worked. And I think in Ted Lasso, he first comes off that way. At first, you're like, is this guy like socially, mentally, emotionally underdeveloped? Is he stuck like perpetually as an 8-year-old? And then as the show goes on, you realize, no, he just like is relentlessly, insistently kind and generous. And there are multiple moments in the show where there are some real wrongs that are done towards him that come to light. And they're the kinds of things that in any other sitcom would be like the whole episode would be spent around trying to resolve this and learning the very special lesson by the time we get to the end of it. And instead, in Ted Lasso, he just goes, okay, I understand. I forgive you. Let's move on. It's just staggering to see someone offer genuine, full-throated, unreserved forgiveness and grace in that kind of a context. To someone trying to sabotage his job, right? To undermine his position and authority, like real wrongs that have implications not just for him, but for the men that he's coaching. He's so completely without guile. And yet again, as the show wears on, it becomes clear none of that is out of naivety. It is him, and he is a very intelligent, observant, careful person who is just choosing every day to live in a state of radical grace. And yeah, it's just inspiring, encouraging, and I think in 2020, exactly what we need.
You know how the show gives you hints of that even early on, JR, is I think in the supporting character of Coach Beard, played by Brendan Hunt, because we know in the first episode that he's read up on the rules of soccer. Like he knows everything that's going on. He even knows the lingo, the local lingo and slang. And he's kind of feeding that to Ted from the very first scene. And Ted wants to learn. He wants to, again, meet these people where they're at. And so I think that undercuts this naive notion that would otherwise make him much less interesting. And yeah, you're totally right about, anti-heroes are kind of maybe not easy to write or envision, but easier to pull off, I think, at least for what we look for in movies and TV these days, than someone who's genuine and warm-hearted like Ted Lasso. And maybe that's part of its appeal too, because it is distinct in that way from the other stuff we're getting on TV. All right, before we go here, I want to share just a couple more quick listener picks, see if any of you have caught any of these. Here's Kevin McLenathan. Kevin's co-host of the Very Good Seeing and Believing podcast. He wrote in to say, the HBO miniseries The Plot Against America, a scarily plausible alternate history about the rise of an American strain of fascism, didn't get nearly as much attention as it should have. And then here's one more here from Andre Salas. Everyone seems to be forgetting that The Good Place finale aired in 2020. It's one of the finest pieces of television I have ever seen. So yeah, looking back, I think it was January 30 of 2020 when The Good Place had its final episode. It feels like 10 years ago. I'm sure some of you saw that. Or how about The Plot Against America? Anyone have any thoughts about either of those?
I watched the first 2 episodes of The Plot Against America and didn't have the emotional bandwidth for it in 2020.
Ah, okay.
I was like, I can't deal with imaginary fascists in America when we have actual ones to deal with.
I might as well just be watching the news. So
right, exactly. Right.
Fair
right,
enough.
right.
Fair enough. Okay.
Again, everything you expect about an HBO show, fantastic acting, amazing production value. The novel that it's based on by Philip Roth, I think I read it back in like the early 90s. It's great. I mean, again, great in those scare quotes of like scary, but informative and helpful. So I have no doubt that the rest of the show is also great. But yeah, couldn't do it. Just couldn't do it this year.
And that's one that Plot Against America, I don't think we covered it all on TC, but we have a number of articles about The Good Place, just such a rich show for theological reflection, and we did write about that finale. Okay, one more thing from you guys, if you'll indulge me. We talked all TV, right? That was this segment, but I know you've been listening to a lot. Claude, you mentioned how you watched mostly movies last year. So very quickly, give me a few recommendations for the best movies, the best music that you came across in 2020. We kind of want listeners to come away from this show with just a massive list of things that they can still check out. How about you, Michelle? Anything you want to throw out there?
Yeah, in terms of music, Drip Latino came out with Reach Records, and it's the first Latin record to reach mainstream Christian music, which is a huge deal. The music is fantastic. I've become a big fan of Tommy Royale, one of the artists featured in the album, so big shout out to that.
All right, thanks. How about you, Claude?
I have another Reach Records release. It's a Happy Thoughts, the EP by Andy Mineo. It's a really creative and interesting album, and I appreciate it because, he's been very open about just struggles as a creative and just mental health and different things like that. So he captures some of that on Happy Thoughts, and there's just a playfulness to the creativity in the music that I think is really appealing, and then artistically is just really skillful. And, a pick for a movie that I think a lot of people will probably see, but I feel like has not been given its due. I'm just going to go ahead and say Tenet. It was a fun movie, and I think we need fun this year. I just had fun. I rewatched it. It benefits from rewatches. Josh, we talked about it, I know, on an earlier TC pod this year. I'm just going to come back and make a claim for my man, Chris Nolan, and for our first Black James Bond. It's just a really fun movie. Don't try to understand it. Just feel it, watch it, enjoy.
I did like those James Bond elements. I'll give you that. And I do have to watch it a second time, so we'll see if I come around a little bit more.
We didn't have a lot of other options, I think, in 2020. If you wanted something like that, I was able to see it in the theater by myself. It was a special moment for me this year.
Yeah, I think a couple of films have gotten that theater bump, that theatrical bump I've heard from people where they found a way to get into a theater at least once or twice. And whatever it was they saw, it could have been one of those kids' TV shows, maybe, Michelle, that you mentioned at the top. It might have been their best theatrical experience in the year because it was their only one. JR, any last thoughts from you for music or movies?
I've been really into an artist for the last year or so named Grandson, who's kind of a hybrid of hip hop, EDM, and like alt rock. And he's been doing like EPs and singles for a couple of years, but he finally just dropped an album called Death of an Optimist at the end of the year. And man, he's sort of a spiritual successor to Rage Against the Machine. He has a song called Thoughts and Prayers. But he's also one of those artists that I would love to sit down and have a conversation with because there's so many biblical allusions like right under the surface of his music. And none of it is explicitly Christian. Much of it is actually not safe for work. Again, I just want to know like what's his background with faith, because some of it feels very deeply formed by a particular sort of Christian perspective. I remain fascinated by him. I find his music very challenging and encouraging and fun. Like a lot of it's really, really fun. So Grandson's Death of an Optimist record is great. And then as far as movies go, I want to throw two out real quick. One is Joe writing about Wolfwalkers. Is that still happening?
Should be up on the site fairly soon.
Yeah, my wife and I watched that last night. Staggering. Like just fantastic. Also sort of about werewolves. So There you go. Like my wife has a strong wolf phobia. And when the movie started, she was like, is this going to be a movie where I end up rooting for the wolves? And I was like, we'll see. I've just been told it's great.
It's kind of the point. Yeah.
Yeah. But another one, it's a horror movie that came out this year from a Guatemalan filmmaker. It's called La Llorona. And it's not the Blumhouse film, The Curse of La Llorona, that was very meh. This is a Guatemalan Spanish language film called La Llorona, and it's actually about a genocide that happened in the 80s in Guatemala and sort of what justice might look like when an entire system is designed not to bring those who run the system to justice. So it's one of those that uses horror to do a lot of social commentary. It's probably the movie I've seen this year that I can't quit thinking about. Just really, really good. And I say horror light in the sense that it's using horror to talk about other things. It is still scary. Yeah. But I think if you're a person who's like, well, I don't like horror movies, this one you might still like, especially if you're concerned about systemic evil and what justice can look like in places where the systems fail. So
yeah, that sounds great. I've had other people recommend it. It's one that slipped past me this year, so I'll have to try to catch up with that myself. We're going to put all of these suggestions on a massive list. Are there any more you want to throw out there real quick?
I forgot to mention films. I will say, I think I watched a lot of bad movies in 2020 that were underwhelming, but I did like Jingle Jangle and just wanted to do a little shout out to that. You know, almost all Black cast, Christian directors, you know, they created it for people of color. You know, we could have Christmas movies that actually reflect our skin color, and Christmas movies rarely do that. So it's something that I'm looking forward to watching year after year.
I didn't get to Jingle Jangle. I'm afraid I can't allow myself now that it's mid to late January. I'm going to have to wait till next season, okay? But good recommendation. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. We are going to put together a massive list of all these suggestions because that's a lot to keep track of. We'll put them in the show notes for this episode. And hopefully that will give you a lot to check out as we move into 2021. Thank you very much to the three of you for joining me to cover all of this stuff. I do want listeners to keep track of you guys as the year goes on. So real quickly, Michelle, where can people follow you? Where's the best place to keep up with you and follow your writing, the podcasts you're on, all the stuff you're going to be up to this year?
Yeah, so I finally got organized and have a website. And so
there you go.
People can actually go to michelleamireyes.com, and I've been able to organize articles, videos, podcasts there, so people can find me there.
There you go. This is exactly what we're looking for. Where can they find that again?
Michelle Ami, that's AMI, michelleamireyes.com. And I guess a shameless promo, I have a book coming out in April called Becoming All Things with Sondervan on cross-cultural relationships. And it's available on pre-order. So if you're into that sort of thing, you can check that out.
No wonder you have 3+ jobs. I can see that now. How about you, JR?
I am at JR Forasteros anywhere that if you find me somewhere that is not that, it's probably not me. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the places.
Easy enough, Claude.
Twitter's best bet, just at Claudacho. And yeah, you can keep up with writing and all sorts of stuff like that.
Great. Thanks again, you guys. I can't wait to talk more this year to each of you. All right.
Thanks,
Bye.
Josh.
Appreciate
Happy New
it.
Year.
Panic on the brain, world has gone insane. Things are starting to get heavy. I can't help but think I haven't felt this way since I asked you to go steady. Wondering, would you be my little quarantine, or is this the way it ends? 'Cause I told you my level of concern, but you walk by like you never heard.
Hello, I'm John J. Thompson, and that was 21 Pilots checking in to see how you're doing. Their song Level of Concern was one of the first pandemic-born hits of the year, and it somehow both captured the energy of the moment and sounded optimistic at the same time. They and so many other artists took the events and energy of 2020, from virus to vitriol and social unrest to social distancing, and turned it into one of the best years for new music in a long, long time. And that is just one of the many songs I have pulled together for this special Best of 2020 Spotify playlist that corresponds with this episode of the Think Christian podcast. Oh, and it's a banger. Currently at 80 songs and counting, this is a wildly eclectic batch of tunes from a diverse slate of artists, including Dylan, Inhaler, Watkins Family Hour, Madison Cunningham, Foo Fighters, Dawes, Sufjan, Swift, Mountain Goats, Isbell, Run the Jewels, The Stones, and Her, who you will hear a bit from later on in the show. And some names I can practically guarantee you've never heard of. But even a list this long is bound to be missing something. Take a listen, and then, if you think I've missed something critical, tweet at me, at John J. Thompson, and I'll consider adding it. I've actually already made some changes based on advice from out there, so thank you, everyone. And if you're not already following the playlist, just search for the Think Christian profile on Spotify. This will be the latest episode for a while and will also be listed as its own separate mix as well. And if you'd like to hear 20 albums that were especially meaningful to me this year, head over and check out my True Tunes podcast anytime. And now that 2021 is in full swing and off to a pretty interesting start, you can count on me to keep busy here in the musical trenches, digging for gold and reporting back. Until next time, this is JJT signing off. I've got a lot of records to spin.
Evil is a relay sport when the one who's burned turns to pass the torch. Evil is a relay sport when the one who's burned turns to pass the torch. Evil is a relay sport when the one who's burned turns to pass the torch. Evil is a relay sport when the one who's burned turns to pass the torch. I resent you for being raised right. I resent you for being tall. I resent you for never getting any opposition at all.
Josh Larson here, back with the TC podcast. You just heard Fiona Apple with Relay. That's one of the tracks from her 2020 album, Fetch the Bolt Cutters. That album is an Eric Danielson pick for some of the best music of the year. And Eric is here with me alongside Sarah Welch Larson. Sarah's going to be discussing her pick, Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher. Welcome to the both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here.
All right, so listening to these two albums together, side by side, getting ready for this show, it struck me one way you could describe them both is maybe controlled chaos, which I understand is an oxymoron. It makes no sense, but that's often what arts criticism does, right? So that was my initial impression. I think Bridgers overall probably has a quieter sensibility than Apple, but the song that you want to highlight, Sarah, which we'll get to, builds to this pretty wild crescendo. So I saw some echoes there with Apple's work. Now, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, as that title suggests, that sounds like, it's like this untamable creature who's escaped from her cage. Relay itself, the song we just heard some of, that really strikes me as this chanting confrontation in a way. So maybe we'll start there, Eric, with Relay, and you can tell me what you make of it and maybe a little bit how it fits in with the other things that Apple is doing on Fetch the Bolt Cutters.
Yeah, so I think the idea of her being kind of unleashed is pretty accurate. I mean, this is the first record Fiona Apple's made in about 8 years. And so it feels like she definitely stored up some things to say and got them out on this record. And certainly, like you said, there's some really interesting, just as I was re-listening to it today, vocal parts on the record where her voice is beautiful, but she definitely presents it, in a very raw and very kind of imperfect fashion. Relay, it's just, one of many songs on this record that I keep coming back to, mostly because of the lyrics and which I imagine we'll get into, but where she talks about the idea of evil being a relay sport where you can pass the torch from one person to another, and there can be kind of this cycle of people sinning against each other. And it just struck me that, Fiona Apple's this artist that so many of us met back in the mid-90s when she released the song Criminal, which has another chorus about, sinning against people and what that looks like and what the fallout from that is. And so one of the things of many that I like about this record is it seems like she really has kind of evolved her views over the years, these kind of common themes that have been threaded through her music for some 20-something years now, but they've taken on kind of new life and new experience and all kind of the snowball effect of all these things that have added on to her thoughts about these things. And I think Relay is just a really fitting example of that.
Yeah, there's this sense of sin as this larger thing. There are the personal elements to it, but it is also this larger force that we participate in, I guess is maybe how she's presenting it there, which is really interesting. Sarah, are you a Fiona Apple fan?
It's funny. I'm really glad that I had the excuse to listen to this album again, because I sort of imprinted on like one song off it very early in COVID, but I don't think I was really ready for it. And I'm not sure if that's because I wasn't angry enough yet, or I just wasn't ready for the record to begin with. It was really good to give it a revisit and to listen to it both on its own and then also in contrast with Phoebe Bridgers, because you're right, they're doing some pretty complicated things, but they're doing them in very different ways. And one of the things that I really like about what Fiona Apple's doing here is that she's using a lot of very active, present tense verbs that are very short and they're very to the point. And her music's complex, but it doesn't really feel that way, if that makes any sense at all. That's one of the things that I appreciated, especially about this particular song, because there's not really a lot that she's saying other than just repeating about the cycle and repetition of evil and violence and saying, I'm going to kind of try to break that if I can, but at the same time, recognizing that tendency in herself to want to keep continuing the cycle as well.
Yeah, the form really matches what she's saying there of the song for sure. How about a couple other songs on the album, Eric, that are worth highlighting or mentioning? Because it's the whole piece of work, I think, that you would say is really well worth marking as one of the best of 2020, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is important, I think Relay is probably the standout song to me, but it is important to recognize some of these other tracks because I think, again, probably unfairly, and some of this probably just has to do with the way that we talk about women artists, but I think that Apple kind of gets pegged as, this angry young woman, all in capital letters, sometimes because of her career. But there's such an emotional gamut on this record. And there's some really playful songs. There's some songs where even within, the span of one song, the mood shifts and the tone shifts so much as she seems to be working these ideas out in real time, which I think is some of the greatness of this art, is that it's clearly intentional and deliberate, but it sounds like she's coming to these kind of eureka moments as she's singing. But a couple of other songs that really stand out to me. I mean, one is, I think, kind of the single, if there's a single on this record, which is Shamika, which is this great playful song, at least musically, about Fiona Apple. I mean, I read a little comment from her today about how this is a real story about how she was in, I think, junior high and was kind of trying to hang out with a certain group of girls. And this girl that she said she wasn't even really friends with, this girl Shamika, comes up and says, why are you hanging out with these girls? You don't need to do that. And the tag of the song is, Shamika said I had potential. So Shamika sees something in Fiona Apple that maybe Fiona Apple didn't see in herself. And as the song goes along, she kind of works that out and says, I don't know what she would think of me now. I don't know that I'm going to get another chance to ever see this girl, but she kind of set me on a different course. So that's a really fun one that's deceptively kind of deep. Another that really stands out to me that kind of maybe a little bit closer emotionally to Relay is a song called Under the Table, where she is kind of relaying being at this party and hearing people kind of brag about things and kind of just try to make themselves sound better than they are. And she says, you can kick me under the table all you want, but I won't shut up. She's going to kind of call out the truth of the situation as she sees it.
I told you I didn't want to go to this dinner. I don't go for those ones that you bother about. So when they say something that makes me start to simmer, that fancy wine won't put this fire out. Oh, kick me under the table all you want. I won't shut up. I won't shut up. Kick me under the table all you want. I won't shut up.
And I think that's another track that's really great in that it's an act of defiance, but the way that she sings it, there is kind of this spirit to it, this playfulness, this kind of almost teasing way that the melody is expressed where, yeah, she's being clear. She's not going to be quiet, but she's going to have a little fun with it if she's going to kind of go out in a blaze of glory conversationally at this party. And so, yeah, just throughout, there's just all these great kind of just this way where you get the sense that she's being honest about whatever the feelings are, but the feelings are kind of all across the spectrum.
So let's get to your pick, Sarah, then, Phoebe Bridgers. And maybe we'll start by listening to that song that I alluded to that you wanted to talk about, I Know the End.
A slaughterhouse, an outlet mall, slot machines, fear of God, windows down, heater on, big bolt of lightning hanging low over the coast. Everyone's convinced it's a government drone or an alien spaceship. Either way, we're not alone. I'll find a new place to be from, a haunted house.
Again, Phoebe Bridgers, I Know the End there. What would you say, Sarah? Why is this one of the best songs of 2020 and Punisher one of the best albums?
Oh man, it's kind of funny that Eric and I both picked like female singer-songwriters who are on very different ends of the spectrum, I think, but who are getting at a lot of the same themes. Like Eric was talking about the cycle of evil being something that can be perpetuated. And I think that this particular song off this particular album is really getting at the idea of time as a cycle. And it's interesting because I think when Punisher first came out, people were talking about how it felt very timely for COVID. And I kind of want to reject that in a way, because if it's true, it's always going to be true, regardless of what time that you're listening to it. And maybe it's true about the time period that it was recorded in, but there will always still be something that resonates. And I think the magic trick that she's pulled off here is that she's managed to make something that does continue to resonate throughout this entire year, throughout this absolutely wild cycle of news and everything else that's been going on. But this particular song, I think, gets at that cycle of feeling wounded in a way that the rest of the album doesn't quite get at in the same way. So she's using a lot of cyclical imagery, especially at the very beginning when she's talking about the tornado from The Wizard of Oz, and she's talking about waves and swing sets and like this pull of gravity. And while I was listening to the song and thinking about the conversation we were going to have today, it actually reminded me of this concept from womanist theology that I came across in the past year. So I can't take any credit for any of these ideas. I found it in Karen Baker Fletcher's book, Dancing with God, where she talks about Andrew Sung Park's explanation of the Korean concept of Han. And she kind of compares it to this idea of the blues and the feelings of being sinned against. So in her words, anybody who's been violated, either intentionally or unintentionally, those feelings that you feel afterwards are a result of sin. And I think that Phoebe Bridgers in particular is really good at getting that concept and that feeling of Han or the blues across in her music in a way that understands the cyclical nature of evil and that's willing to just kind of sit in that and tell the truth about that pain that's been visited on her and then on other people as well.
Phoebe Bridgers as blues artist. I like that. I mean, I never would have gotten there on my own, but now that you've described it that way and I'm hearing her music in my head, it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. Does that resonate with you, Eric, with Bridgers' music?
Yeah, for sure. I think that because we've had it in our kind of musical lexicon for so long, I don't think we always remember that the blues originally was really just this great mood music, and I think that Phoebe Bridgers does that on this record. The atmospheric nature of this album is so strong, and it really invites you to sit with, the feelings and the experiences and the memories and all of the kind of complicated things that Sarah was just describing, and really kind of, sit with that lament, sit with that frustration, sit with your desire that, something would change, that something would give. And so, yeah, I love that idea. I think that's right on.
So I started by comparing the two, and now you've given me ways they're both really distinct, because I too would have said Bridgers provides mood music and Apple is the opposite. Like, as I've been thinking about talking about these two albums, I would often want to put Phoebe Bridgers on while I'm doing something else, and it would seem like something that I would like to have on in the background. And then I'd think about, well, I should listen to Fetch the Bolt Cutters again. And then it's like, wow, I'm really going to have to sit down and only do that because I'm not going to be able to concentrate on anything else. But I'm really glad we had this conversation. Now I can see those attitudes could also be switched. It's Punisher that I need to sit down and attend to. And maybe Fetch the Bolt Cutters is a little more fun than I was giving it credit for. And I can just give it a spin on its own.
Fiona Apple, I mean, if you don't want to hear her yelping in your ear while you're doing dishes, I'm not really sure, what kind of life you're leading. And so I think it is right to do a little sonic exchange on these two albums.
All right, I'll give that a try. So before we go, I want to give you both a chance to quickly name any movies or TV shows that might have also been highlights for you in 2020. Sarah, what stood out to you from last year?
Oh man, so much. But in terms of TV, What We Do in the Shadows was actually a really nice escape from some of the pressures of the summer. I like kind of laughing at the foibles of characters that the TV show clearly loves as well. And so that was a really good piece of TV for me and for my husband as we were just on the couch. And then in terms of movies, First Cow really got me in a way. I feel like I describe it as a gentle movie, but there's kind of this backbone of iron in there too. And like a thread of anxiety that took me a really long time to like kind of tease out. Like I saw this movie 9 months ago and I'm still thinking about it and I'm still finding some complexity in there.
Yep.
But yeah, that one's a really rich one and also deceptively simple, kind of like the music that we talked about this evening.
Yeah. Yeah. On first viewing, it can strike you that way. But man, there is a ton there in First Cow, the Kelly Reichardt film. How about you, Eric? What else did you notice last year?
Yeah, so I certainly don't have the depth of experience with film that both of y'all do, but you guys know that we have the big True False Film Fest in Columbia every year where I live, and that was amazingly somehow still happened about a week or two before the lockdown and was the last cultural thing I did with people in 2020. But there were several films that I know have been mentioned at TC and on other pods kind of related to this group of folks that people will have heard of, but so many of those films just really struck me this year. Bloody Nose, Empty Pockets from the Ross brothers, the fantastic movie Time by Garrett Bradley. And then I know we've talked about this at TC, but I can't think of a more moving, more delightful, just kind of visceral experience that I've had with a film this year than Dick Johnson Is Dead, Kirsten Johnson's film.
For
and
sure.
A film that, again, everybody's already talked about, but, one of those movies that to me is a little bit of a reclamation of, we talk about in the scripture, where's the sting in death? And I feel like Kirsten and Dick Johnson steal just a little bit of the sting back in that movie. And I really love that about it.
I loved that movie. Yeah.
Beautiful way to describe it. So you guys have named, I think there we hit 3 of my top 10 lists. So I like very much what you're selling. All right, before you take off, maybe let listeners know where they can continue to follow you through the rest of this year to keep up with music stuff, but also the other things, cool stuff that I know you guys will both be up to. Sarah, where can they best keep track of you?
I'm on the internet, but especially Twitter under the handle Dodgy Boffin, DODGYBOFFIN, and I mostly holler about science fiction over there. So if you're interested in talking about that, please hit me up.
Excellent. How about you, Eric?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Eric Danielson. My name is spelled quite differently, but you'll see it on the description of this show, I'm sure. And I also have a shiny new website, which is just ericdanielson.com. And I'll have things there for you to see as well.
Nice timing. All right. Thanks so much to the both of you.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
All right, before we move on to movies, we're going to hear a little bit of a 2020 single that John J. Thompson put on his best of playlist for this episode. It's a playlist that introduced me to the R&B artist Her. Here she is with Hold On.
On me, you ain't been holding on to me. I can't wait too long. I don't wanna keep. It's hard to sleep. Wanna be free. Wanna be free. How do you get somewhere comfortable?
Josh Larson again, eager to talk movies with Catherine Freeman, Abby Olcese, and Joe George. It was a good year for movies, but a tough year for movie going. Aside from a showing of Tenet in a sparsely attended theater, I haven't seen anything on a big screen since March, thanks to the coronavirus. How have each of you guys been coping? Maybe I'll start with you, Abby. Have you basically been wearing your TV out, or how have you been handling this?
I've basically been wearing my TV out. It's been particularly interesting to be doing the consideration, like awards consideration cycle this time around, because the way that gets distributed is pretty markedly different than it's been in years past. So I've been doing a variety of media for that, like watching stuff on physical DVDs, trying to find apps that I download onto my TV, hooking up a second monitor to my laptop in order to actually watch something on a decent sized screen. So that's been the thing that I've probably struggled with the most. But in terms of finding new stuff to watch, I've been really kind of pleasantly surprised with the strength of the films that came out this year.
Yeah, I wonder if that screener method is going to stick, as we move on here. And if that seems, at least from the distributor's ends, to be a little simpler. I certainly hope not. How about you, Catherine? I don't know how many movies, you get to in a theater in a year on a regular year, but I imagine that took a hit this year.
Yeah, I have not seen a movie. I was trying to think of what the last movie I saw in the theaters was, and I'm pretty sure it was Just Mercy, which came out in January.
Sounds right.
And I am a regular moviegoer. It's like my self-care thing. I probably go like more than 2 to 3 times a month. And so when we started emailing to put this list together, I really struggled because I've watched a lot of TV. I did not watch a lot of movies. So I haven't seen Tenet, like a lot of the films that were released, digitally. I just didn't. I'm excited that all of the movies we're discussing I have actually seen because I did not see a lot of movies this year.
Yeah, that works out well. How about you, Joe?
Like Abby, it's been a 4-year consideration run this past month. I think I've seen 60 movies over the past 30 days, just trying to get through everything. So on the one hand, impressive. It's nice. Yeah, no, it's not impressive. It's unhealthy. On the one hand, it's nice to be able to like watch some of the screeners with family, where
That's
we
true.
couldn't always drag everybody. We could all sit down and watch. Guess everybody got to watch Soul and Wonder Woman right away. But, that sort of thing is neat. But, I miss the quiet isolation of the movie theater. I just want somebody to kick the back of my seat or text in front of me. Just something lovely like that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how all those annoyances might feel good when we finally get back to them. Well, talking about the best movies of the year, at least this segment, what we've got planned, pretty easy for me to prep for because 2 of the picks you guys made, Soul and Lovers Rock, they made my personal top 10 of the year. While the third, Spike Lee's Da 5 Bloods, a movie I liked quite a bit. So maybe we'll start there with Da 5 Bloods. That was your pick, Joe. I talked with Claude Atcho about this last year on the podcast on our Black Lives Matter episode. So listeners can check that out for more of my thoughts. But tell me, Joe, what made it special for you?
Well, okay, so I have to stop first and point out that the best movie I actually watched in 2020, and maybe Abby feels the same way, was Velocipaster, which we watched with our colleague Jared Forasteros.
Oh, yes.
Via virtual watch party. But that came out a few years ago, so we couldn't talk about that one for the best. But I just need to throw that out there. Otherwise,
is JR paying you to squeeze that in? He's still trying to round up enough reviews on Apple Podcasts for the TC podcast to get me to watch it. I think if we hit like 70 or something like that. So,
Josh, I got to tell you, I went in skeptical. It was a good movie.
Oh, boy.
It's a really good
movie.
movie.
Let's move on. Let's please move on.
Back to a slightly better movie, The 5 Bloods. So for me, it was just, it's shocking that this far into his career, Spike Lee is still this inventive and audacious. I mean, who else has been working as long as him and is still reinventing? I mean, he has his sort of signature shots, but he is still at this point pushing film as far as it can possibly go to be relevant and passionate and thoughtful and political and all of these things all at once. Like Scorsese and David Lynch are about the only other two who are still reinventing themselves this far into it. So every time he puts out a movie, they don't always hit for me, but every time he puts out a movie, I'm always excited to see it. And this one, I mean, gasping while I'm watching it. Again, the whole, we'll talk more about this in a minute. I'm sure you guys talked about it back in the summer, but there's this whole monologue that Delroy Lindo's character gives, direct address to the camera, and it is magnetic. And even watching it in my living room with kids upstairs thumping around, it still zeroed in and held all my attention and literally made me gasp. So that was the movie that that stuck with me the most. By the end of the year, a couple of movies had knocked it down, so it ended up in my number 3, but it's the one that I think about the most still.
Okay. Yeah, Delroy Lindo playing one of the returning Vietnam veterans who go back over the course of the film to honor a fallen comrade from the war and also to seek out some gold that's been hidden there. So it's a genre mix from Spike Lee in what's going on here, but also incredibly topical, even though it's revisiting something from many decades ago in American history. And that's what Spike does. I mean, you're right. He's not slowing down isn't the right phrase. He hasn't calmed down, maybe is a better phrase. And you wouldn't want him to. You don't want to see the stately Spike Lee. At least I don't ever really want to see that. He can shift gears and do different things. We saw that this year with David Byrne's in American Utopia, where he was the director of this live concert film. So yeah, it's not that he just does one thing, but he certainly has not lost the passion. Catherine, Abby, maybe we'll go to you next, Abby. What'd you guys make of Da 5 Bloods?
I really appreciated a lot of what Spike Lee was doing in Da 5 Bloods. And I should also take a second to recognize that his co-writer on the film, Kevin Wilmot, is a film professor at the University of Kansas. So he's kind of a hometown hero. We're all extremely proud of his recent successes in the last couple of years. Yeah. Yeah, I thought there was a lot going on in that movie that I found fascinating. A lot of really interesting character work. Delroy Lindo's performance in particular was obviously just like so multi-layered and interesting. And another thing that I've found really interesting about watching Spike Lee movies, like the more cinematically literate that I've gotten in my life, is just noticing what movies he's choosing to reference in different films and trying to figure out what he finds valuable about the films that he's referencing. So like in this particular case, he goes really hard on Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which I think I caught initially and I was like, oh, well, that's an interesting, like subtle Treasure of the Sierra Madre reference. And then by the end, it's just like, it's a 10-ton weight. Like you can't get away from it. But yeah, just the themes that he's playing with there and how those ideas of success and regret and all of this stuff coming back and how that particularly applies to the story of Black Vietnam vets and the story that he's trying to tell, I think I was super fascinated by the way that it applied. I think there were some elements of the movie that didn't always work for me, but the core of it I thought was really compelling.
Yeah, you're right. There's always an element of like film history critique in a Spike Lee film where he's offering that lens, looking back at what we've maybe praised before and asking us why or to rethink that. And you see that in Da 5 Bloods for sure. How about you, Catherine? What'd you make of it?
Yeah, I really loved it. I mean, I've just loved the nuanced portrayal of Black people. I have an aunt who is very much a supporter of the current president. And so I feel like oftentimes when you see Black people in film, it's just like one story that's always told. And I feel like one of the many things I appreciate about Spike Lee is that he's always created a space to tell multiple stories and that it's not just one narrative. And, it feels very familiar. Like the characters all feel very familiar to me. I also thought it was interesting maybe I'm like one of the few people that sat through all like 12 hours of Ken Burns' Vietnam, but he did do an episode on Black Vietnam vets. And I found that to be super interesting in talking to, real life veterans. And so then to see that on screen really pull out more of that nuance and to really focus and hone in on, like even the conversation between the soldiers and the Vietnamese people of like how they were seeing like American colonialism with civil rights. And there are many questions because even for African Americans, I mean, we're still Americans. And so like we have that sort of we have that as much as people of European heritage. And so I thought him bringing that kind of to the forefront was really smart and wise. And, knowing what I know now about Chadwick Boseman, like his performance and like just to have gone there and done that and how physically difficult it must have been, I knew he was brilliant, but like a new appreciation for just stamina and resilience and commitment to the craft.
Yeah, he's incredible in a little bit more than a cameo performance, but he's not one of the main characters, but he kind of does hover over the film spiritually in the part that he plays. And the documentary element, you can see that even in Da 5 Bloods, Catherine, right? How Spike Lee uses archival footage of actual soldiers, Black soldiers from the time, and weaves it into this fiction tale that we're being told. And that's sort of a technique he's used before, but it's just always so effective to kind of reorient our perspective, in this case, on that particular moment in history. So yeah, 2 Spike Lee films in 1 year. I mean, that's a very good thing. Let's go to Soul next, which is your pick, Abby. This one is my number 2 film of the year. It's actually my number 5 Pixar film overall. And that's no small thing because I'm a bit of a Pixar fanatic and I'm fussy about, changing these ranking lists. But I was just so overwhelmed with this movie when I saw it, which was probably, maybe early mid-November. I just kind of needed Soul then. So maybe I am elevating it for when I saw it. But right now I'm okay with that. I can't wait to hear what your take is on Soul, Abby.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, just before this, was catching up on your write-up on the website about it, Josh, and I really appreciated some of the things that you had to say about that, which definitely cross over to the stuff that I found really powerful about it. I am at a point in my life personally where I am kind of figuring out my own priorities, like in terms of career goals, personal goals, what I would like to achieve in my life. And so for me, this movie hit at like a particular time where some of the elements that Joe Gardner, Jamie Foxx's character in the film, that he's going through are like thoughts that I've had, conversations that I've had with my parents and my colleagues about like what my purpose is in life, what I would like to do, like what my big break might look like versus like the things that I should be taking time for. I've also been doing a lot of like extra freelance work this year. And so I was approaching Soul at a point where I was starting to feel a little bit burnt out with all of the extra work that I'm doing, which like is not a reflection on TC at all. Please keep me on the podcast. This is a joy to do. This is not one of the things dragging me down.
Good to hear. Good to hear.
Yeah, but it was a good reminder of what really is important in life. And I think that kind of dovetails with your thoughts on it, Josh. I think a little bit about recognizing like the wonder of incarnation, of just like the beauty that's around us, especially during a time when that's really hard to do, just emotionally. And I mean, we're talking at a point in the year where it's particularly difficult to do. There's been a lot of turmoil lately. And so it's really important, I think, to be able to slow down and recognize the stuff that's in your immediate vicinity and the things that truly bring you joy and the things that give your life meaning, and figure out how to recognize and balance all of that and to be present in it, which I think is also an element that we're probably going to talk about a little bit in Lover's Rock when we get to that. I feel like presence is an important part of that movie as well. So yeah, I found a lot of gentle beauty in that, which I think is something that Pete Docter also does really well. And I know that he's a person of faith too. So I feel like that particular aspect of it comes through really strongly. And I think that his partnership on that with Kemp Powers was really strong as well, because there's an authenticity to that like clearly only a partnership with somebody who is part of the community that you're trying to depict is going to actually achieve.
Yeah, Ken Powers, the co-director and co-writer of the screenplay. Yeah, that's so fascinating, Abby, to describe like your place, your mindset in watching Soul, and it would absolutely speak to that. This main character is a band teacher, but he wants to be a famous jazz musician, right? And he gets sort of that big break, and then it gets pulled away from him. Soul, to me, hits with a very simple message, like you were saying, just stop to enjoy the beauty of what's before you. But that's been so hard to do, and we don't even have the motivation to do that. And the body swapping element of the movie, which I'm not even going to get into, it's such a convoluted plot, is where the incarnation idea struck me, where we suddenly get to experience regular old living, is the phrase that's used, through someone else's eyes. And those new eyes do recognize what is beautiful, even amidst turmoil, about being human. So Soul hit me in similar ways. How about you, Catherine? What'd you make of Soul?
Yeah, I mean, I really loved the story. I mean, I thought visually it was a little weird in the beginning. The sort of afterlife place was an interesting, unique Pixar choice. But I think what I loved about the story was that he was such a fantastic mentor. And one of the things that really struck me is when they eventually went through all of the different, like, famous, well-accomplished people that had tried to mentor 22 before, which is like the kind of disembodied soul character. And all of them were terrible. Like, they were all terrible mentors. And this idea of, like, you know, thinking about the incarnation, but then it's like, what really matters, yeah, is kind of what you give to other people. And I think that was kind of in his face the whole time. Like, the reason why he got his big break is because one of his students who, you know, he helped stick with music was, you know, the musician for this famous jazz artist. And so I think also too, to just like slow down and appreciate what you do have. And you get to a certain age in life and all of us have disappointments. And I think the tendency is to focus on those disappointments. And so what I really liked is just like a celebration of like, don't get caught up in the things that you feel like God did not give you, and like to remember all of the beautiful, because he has done so much and many, many things. And so I liked that it was a call to that. And then just to the importance of discipleship and the kind of skill it takes to be a good discipler.
It does seem like this is a movie made for a certain age, or you have to at least have lived long enough or experienced enough, particularly career-wise, to maybe appreciate it. I mean, what I've always loved about Pixar is they make movies for the parents first, usually the adults first. But this is the one that maybe might not even be for kids.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh,
Joe,
totally. Yeah.
How did it strike you that way?
My kids were not into it as much.
Okay, so there you go.
It bounced off of them pretty hard, especially my older kids who are teenagers and their life is just starting out. And so,
Right, yeah.
They're constantly in the zone. It didn't work for them, but kind of like Abby's saying, for us old, tired, broken down, sad people, it hits pretty hard.
Oh, boy.
And those those visualizations actually really worked well for me. That was my favorite part of the movie. And I don't think they're entirely successful, but I like you can see him really pushing the form, trying to figure out how do we visualize these pre-body identities. And then the whole image of the zone I thought was perfect. This sort of inverted sunken place where, you are in that perfect place where everything is pulled together and everything's clicking for you. And even if that visual didn't quite entirely work for me, I loved what they were going for. And I absolutely know that feeling there that was working. So I think you're right. It is not necessarily a kid one, but us old people, we dig it.
Yeah, definitely one of their most ambitious in terms of the ideas at play and how they're going to, similar to Inside Out in some ways. And I think some people have seen that as a negative. Pete Docter also did Inside Out, but I think it found enough unique elements to explore these really complicated ideas. All right, so that leaves your pick, Catherine, which was my favorite film of the year. It's Lovers Rock. This is one of the 5 films that make up the Small Axe anthology from British director Steve McQueen. All 5 of these are set in London between the late 1960s and the early 1980s. They explore various corners of the city's Caribbean community. And you can watch all 5 of these right now if you have Amazon Prime. They're right there. Lovers Rock was I enjoyed all of these, but for me, probably the most beautiful piece of filmmaking in the series. But tell me why you picked it, Catherine.
Yeah, I think visually, the scene, kind of the long scene of them dancing to that song that everybody knows, just was probably the most joy I have had in watching a film in a really long time. I think oftentimes, again, African-American films only show one segment and struggle of Black life in America or in the Caribbean, and it's just this one narrative, usually a slave or servant narrative. And so I love the depiction of Black joy. I mean, you get little hints there, I think, where the bouncer has to chase away some people who are like trying to throw rocks at one of the girls, of life kind of outside of this reggae house party. But for the most part, it's very self-contained. And yeah, it's just, I think it's beautifully shot. I think the joy, the sort of, to go back a little bit into Soul, just the ordinariness of it, like the way that it starts where they're like laughing and making food for the party and they're like moving furniture and you're not really sure what's going on. And it's in those details how he creates this moment. And we don't know what happens with a couple. They meet at the party, if they end up, having this grand love story, but just that sort of feeling, kind of a regular old Saturday night and like meeting this person that you connect with and just telling the story in a way that is joyful and even in the more like uncomfortable moments of the film, of this idea of like solidarity and togetherness. And yeah, I just felt like it was so loving. Like that really came across to me in that movie. I mean, Lovers Rock is in the title, but like just the joy, I think, and love that went into making that particular one. And as someone who watches a lot of British television, which oftentimes I'm like, where are the Black people? I know Black people live, And so to like finally have a film of like, oh, this is where they are. But
Steve
it was
McQueen
great.
found them and
Yeah.
thankfully brought the community to us. Lovers Rock, the way you're describing it, Catherine, stands apart even from the other Small Axe films, which, as I said, are all really good, but most of them do chronicle some sort of struggle. And the first one has a balance of both. Mangrove, you see the community of this restaurant and the joy and the life there, but then you also see the oppression that they're facing. And Lovers Rock, which is just set on this one night in this one house party, though there's those little hints of what's outside the house, it just creates this protective bubble. Did you enjoy it too, Abby?
I did. Yeah, I think as a whole, I liked that Small Axe kind of had room for movies like Lovers Rock, where it's a shorter film. I think it's around like 70 minutes ish.
Yeah.
Like it's not even a full 80, but like it can still be part of the series. Like you can kind of diverge a little bit from like these other narratives to smaller, more experimental things that are more about a specific slice of life and experience, like this one particular place and time that's important to a community. And I think that's what's really evident throughout the movie is just like you are a fly on the wall in this area that was like a common regular Saturday night occurrence for Black British people of a certain generation. Like this is what you did. And there are some parts of me, like the parts of me that really crave structure, that's like, oh, I want to spend more time with these characters and get to know them. But that's not really the point. The point is just to like watch them be. And so that was a bit of a challenge for me, but it was a good challenge. And it was one that I was kind of glad to have the opportunity to take.
Where are you at, Joe, with Lovers Rock?
Oh, I adored this movie. It is fantastic. It's a perfect short story of a movie, and we need to give some recognition to Cortia Newland, who co-wrote the screenplay, that it reminds me of a literary short story where we're kind of introduced to these little hints of characters that get developed in this very compact amount of time with little motions, and just the love that McQueen has for his subjects with all the things that his camera catches. There's this one sequence that's it pans along the room and it just watches hands on hips. We just watch people holding hands, placing their hands gently on one another's hips. And it's such a lovely, intimate moment that he's filming with such adoration. And we get the same thing with the sing-along moment that Catherine mentioned. There's the moment where I think it's largely the men chanting Mercury sound over and over again at the end of a song. And any other director would cut it, and he just lets it go because he loves this so much. And all of the emotions that we follow in, like Abby said, not even 80 minutes, and we get these full character arcs and all of these themes and emotions. It's amazing. It is amazing for him to do one movie like that this year, let alone 4 other really good movies. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And, to cut away, as you were saying, from that moment would pop the bubble. And this is what he's created, is this bubble of freedom. And it doesn't want to puncture that with the filmmaking. So you guys have both mentioned the 2 moments for me. It's the sing-along to Silly Games, and that's another very extended moment where we don't cut away. The DJ lets the song cut out, but the people at the party just sing like a choir together, and that goes on for a while, and the moment is sustained. And then, that elegantly edited sequence of the men inviting the women onto the dance floor, where we see the hands touching the waist or the elbow. We rarely get visions of the way things should be. It's often, I think this speaks to your point, Catherine, about films about the Black experience. It's often about the way things are wrong. But this is a vision of the way things one day will be, I think. There are moments in Lovers Rock that have that intimacy, the community, the music, the movement that give us this vision of flourishing. And I think that's what I felt while watching it, and why, it was the movie of the year for me. So a lot of music talk there. Let's move on real quickly from the movies. I know this is our movie segment, but as Catherine mentioned, she watched a lot of TV this year. I know you guys keep up with music as well. So really quickly, let's go around. I'd love to hear if there are any albums from 2020 that you resonated with, or maybe TV shows that you want to highlight. Maybe throw 1 or 2 out real quickly here. Abby, let's start with you.
I really enjoyed watching The Queen's Gambit this year. I appreciated the cinematic nature of it, I guess, but also the performances, the attention to detail, but also like the arc of that character and the way that it pays off, especially in the final episode, is just like this really lovely moment of joy and success. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of like the Fred Rogers quote of thinking of all the people who loved you into being. I think it's a really interesting show for a lot of reasons, but that payoff at the end really made it for me. Album-wise, I'm a big fan of the band Idols, a punk band from Bristol in the UK. And they put out an album this year called Ultra Mono. A thing that I really appreciate about Idols is their aggressive vulnerability, I guess is a great way to put it. So like they have the swagger of a punk band, but the songs that they're singing are very much about like radical inclusion. And you get the sense that they really fight for the people that they care about, and the people they care about are vulnerable people. And so in this particular year, in this particular setting, it felt both cathartic and comforting. So I'm glad they're around.
Nice. Catherine, what you got?
So my favorite TV show, the thing that I watched, I mean, there were a lot, but I'm going to go with The Good Lord Bird because I feel like not a lot of people are talking about it and everybody needs to. a dramedy, I guess, would be the genre, like a depiction of John Brown's raid, but it also has these comedic moments. And I feel like the question is kind of like, is John Brown a good guy or is he a madman? And it kind of goes back and forth. Ethan Hawke was phenomenal. His character work and really getting you to believe, fully committed to that character. I think Daveed Diggs' portrayal of Frederick Douglass, like I loved it. It was very irreverent, but very true. It felt true to me, kind of the more ridiculous elements. He was a great leader, and this is not a disparagement of Frederick Douglass, but some elements of his personal life were slightly ridiculous. And I think bringing that out and just kind of giving the fullness of the characters and the stories. And I think where it lands is kind of like John Brown is important because of what he meant in leading into the Civil War, and kind of there were so many great moments. One of my favorites, I think it's the episode where Harriet Tubman shows up and, he's got all of these African-Americans, free people. They're now living in Canada because they escaped slavery. And they're like pressing him on like, what's your plan? Like, we do want to help you. We are with you. Slavery is terrible. We know slavery is terrible. We've all escaped it. And he won't tell them. And it's like, this is just, and it's not until Harriet Tubman comes and like gives him a level of like credibility that sort of people are galvanized. And he has to ask himself some tough questions too. As much as his cause is righteous, his sort of view of African Americans is also rooted in white supremacy. And that I thought the film did a really good job of exploring that alongside of his good intentions and good heart person. So I really loved Good Lord Bird albums. I feel like you know what I'm going to say, Josh.
I'm waiting for it.
So I'm just going to go with Taylor Swift's Folklore. I really like Evermore too, but I feel like Folklore is a more complete album. It's like for a year that most of us spent inside kind of soundtrack for that. I think, it fits totally with her character. I think Taylor Swift is an Enneagram 3. The idea that she was just going to sit in her house for a year and not do anything. But I also just kind of love the ways in which she's sort of matured. So she's not telling strictly autobiographical stories anymore. And I think in some of the ways in which she's not doing that, the songs are stronger. I think Epiphany is about her grandfather who fought in World War I. And so I really loved the album. I feel like it's a good reset for her in her career, in a year in which a lot of us are resetting and have had a lot of time to think and reconsider. And I felt like it was a really good soundtrack for asking questions and changing direction.
You almost wonder if she had released this as like a double album, it would have spared us, the having to compare the two, which one is better. But
yeah, I think she should have done the double album thing.
We can just think about it that way, maybe. So, Joe, I saw you nodding when Catherine was talking about Good Lord Bird. That's one you would highlight from 2020 as well, a TV series?
Yeah, for all the reasons that Catherine said. There's nothing I need to repeat there. She nailed it. It is energetic. It is extremely well acted. It is irreverent but true. And one thing I guess I'd add is that I think it is mandatory viewing for white people because it does absolutely interrogate John Brown's motivations. Somebody who is, on the one hand, is so angry at slavery that he's willing to fight against it and take up arms against it. And on the other hand, is so oblivious to the actual Black people around him that he can't even properly identify the name and gender of the man that is closest to him. So it is fantastic. So yeah.
I was a big fan of that show as well. I also am a proud native of Lawrence, Kansas. And so it was considered mandatory viewing for everybody in the area. But Catherine, I just wanted to let you know that I regularly look at my cats and ask them if they have a fire in their heart for justice. So
I love it.
All right, Joe, was there one more thing you wanted to throw in there?
We had 2 Star Trek shows this year, and everybody's talking about the Star Wars show. 2 Star Trek shows this year, one very irreverent comedy called Lower Decks, and one very deeply emotional series called Discovery that I think is the show that anybody who is disheartened about the way that the world has fallen apart, or maybe more accurately, the problems in our country are becoming increasingly apparent. It is somehow the most hopeful and optimistic show to watch about people scrambling to put together something that could be good and just and fair. And it does what Star Trek does best, which is believe in the best in people. So I strongly recommend that show as well. And then album-wise, I don't know. I'm old white dad from the Midwest. My favorite album is whichever Wilco album I still have in the car. I think it's Sky Blue Sky. So Sky Blue Sky, great. Wilco.
Wasn't Jeff Tweedy's solo album last year?
I don't know, man.
That?
I don't listen to new music. Yeah, I totally do. My kids run my Spotify. I have no idea.
Stick to Star Trek, right? Okay.
Yep, we'll do.
I mean, I know you didn't ask us this, but since we're talking about Good Lord Bird, I'd also like to put in a plug for Deacon King Kong, which is by James McBride, he is the writer. Good Lord Bird is based on a book that he wrote. Yeah, if you want to restore faith in humanity, Deacon King Kong. He writes so well the story of this kind of aged deacon in 1960s housing projects in Brooklyn, and the story of that community and the ways in which they are bound together. And it was my top read of 2020. I love James McBride. I think he's a fantastic storyteller. So we didn't talk about books, but for the readers.
I love it. All sorts of good recommendations there. So if listeners want to get these like throughout the year as we move into 2021, they should follow you guys, follow your work. Real quickly here, Catherine, what's the best place for people to keep up with you?
I have a website, CatherineAFreeman.com. And then, on social media, Twitter is @CatherineAnnette.
How about you, Abby?
Yeah, Twitter's probably the most consistent place to find links to all of the different things I'm doing, @Abby Olchesi on Twitter. I also am the film editor at The Pitch, and their website is thepitchkc.com. They're a alt monthly based here in Kansas City. So that is where I do most of my bigger writing these days.
Excellent. Joe?
Yeah, just follow me on Twitter @JAGeorgeII. I have a website, but I never update it. So just follow me there.
Okay. Will do. Thank you so much, you guys. And yes, Abby, of course, we're going to keep talking to you on the podcast. Hopefully
good.
More of your articles on the website. Same for you, Joe and Catherine. I'm looking forward to doing it all again this year. So thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
All right. We're going to go out here with one of the classic reggae tracks that is featured in Lovers Rock. It's not a 2020 song, but thanks to McQueen's film, it's one that I'm going to always associate probably with this year and definitely with one of the year's best movies. This is Dennis Brown's Things in Life.
It's not every day we're gonna be the same way. No. There must be a change somehow.
Again, that was Things in Life, a 1973 song by Dennis Brown, and it's one of the many great numbers featured in Lovers Rock. If you haven't watched Lovers Rock yet, it and the entire Small Axe anthology, all 5 of those films by Steve McQueen, they are available right there for you on Amazon Prime. I hope we've convinced you it's well worth checking out. And I hope you've heard about a bunch of stuff that you can watch and listen to as we all ease into 2021. Music, movies, TV that either echo the gospel or evidence our need for the good news or sit alongside God's story in some other compelling way. Thanks to all the listeners who sent in their picks for this show. Quickly, here are a few more that we received. Josh Balog mentioned the John Guerra album Keeper of Days. Jacob Dial mentioned the nature documentary My Octopus Teacher. James Wallace brought up Netflix's Enola Holmes. Aaron Potter had the David Fincher film Mank on his list. And then Toby Wollaston, a film critic writing all the way from New Zealand, had a plug for Rosie, a movie from Ireland. Lastly, one more note to share here from Kevin Scott. Kevin writes about video games for TC, and he wanted us to be sure to acknowledge one of his favorite games, I think from the last couple of years, and that's Hades. Kevin wrote, "It's exquisitely crafted, and it's a story about the persistence of love. In spite of its pagan narrative frame, it's really a kind of Jesus story." So Kevin elaborates on that in the TC piece he wrote about Hades. You can find that and all the articles that have been mentioned on this show over at thinkchristian.net. Now, if you want to make sure you don't miss any articles we put out, any of those posts, the best thing to do is to subscribe to receive our emails, and you can do that at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. If you enjoyed the mega format of this episode, you might want to check out our Best of the 2010s show that we did last year. I think that was episode 24. It also featured the whole podcast team, and we shared picks covering the last decade. So if you missed that, you like this episode, please do check that one out as well. The Think Christian podcast is a production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Basselin. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.